I want to go ahead and introduce our author for tonight. We have with us historian Zachery A, who is Assistant Professor of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. And Dr. Fry received his PhD from Ohio State University, and he is here tonight, or here virtually tonight, to speak on his new book, A Republic in the Ranks, Loyalty and Dissent in the Army of the Potomac. And his book is available through University of North Carolina Press, and I understand that they are doing 40% off. And then also, of course, you can find his book on Amazon as well. But with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to tonight's guest.
All right. Thank you, Kelly. Can everybody hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me okay?
Sounds good. And I think
Sounds
everybody
good.
Else is muted, so I don't
All
know
right.
if people will give you any thumbs up, but.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here virtually. It's great to talk to you guys. It's always fun to get together with folks who appreciate the Civil War as much as folks do who attend these sorts of things. So much appreciated for your time tonight. As Kelly said, I'm going to be talking about my book on politics in the Union Army, especially in the Army of the Potomac. So if you didn't think you had enough partisan politics in your life this campaign season, buckle up, because we'll have some fun talking about Republicans and Democrats and all of the nefarious things they were up to in the 1860s. A brief disclaimer: I'm sitting here in my study in my apartment up here in Prince William County, where my wife and I live. We have a 1-month-old baby girl who occasionally has sort of a meltdown, especially this time in the evening. So if you start to hear that, my apologies. It's not because there's a child being neglected out there. It's just because every once in a while that happens to a 5-week-old, I guess. And also, as I was telling Kelly beforehand, you might also hear some scratching at the door, because this is where my cats will be wanting their dinner. So with that in mind, I'll go ahead and get started. I have some slides I'll show you, so I'll turn my my nerdy face off here and show you the presentation I came up with. Basically, what I'd like to do tonight is give you just a very brief outline of what I try to argue in this book. And then I thought what I would do is take about a half hour and walk you through some of the really relatively unknown episodes in the story of the Union Army when it comes to politics, things that even some of the most seasoned of Civil War buffs probably don't know that much about when it comes to the story of the Army of the Potomac. So I just picked a few episodes out of the book to highlight, just to sort of give you a taste, give you a flavor for the sorts of things you might find in the book if you're so interested. So I'll go ahead and share the PowerPoint. And then this is relatively new to me as well, so hopefully, all right. Give it just a second to turn on here. Hopefully you guys can see the PowerPoint, all right? Yes? Good, all right. So when you're talking about the Union Army, and especially the Army of the Potomac, it's impossible not to talk about its politics in the context of the guy who comes to illustrate everything that is political about the Army, and that, of course, is George B. McClellan. What I was interested in looking at in this book is, what did politics do to the Union Army? And I was also interested, of course, in the reverse. What did the Union Army do to Northern politics? I found this tremendous breadth of experience that Union soldiers have with politics as the war goes on. The war was a political education for Union soldiers, especially in the Army of the Potomac. And I think for a couple key reasons. First of all, the Army of the Potomac was really close to Washington, D.C. at any point in its service, right? Never more than a few days' march from Washington, D.C., the seat of power, of course. So there's that. Also, George McClellan, the one-time beloved commander of the Army of the Potomac, will be in 1864 the Democratic presidential nominee against Republican Abraham Lincoln. So it's very, very interesting to see how the Army of the Potomac goes from loving George McClellan in 1862 to voting overwhelmingly against him in 1864. So looking at the McClellan legacy was something that really, really interested me. What I found over the course of my research was that, like I said, the war was a political awakening for Union soldiers, young men who might have understood the broad political contours of the 1860s when they signed up to serve in the war. It remained for the war to really educate them on the particular policy differences that would come to animate the Northern war effort as the war went on. So the result of all this political awakening for Union soldiers was, I argue, an army that vehemently argued for loyalty to the administration, to the Lincoln administration. They really came to capitalize on Northern newspapers and opinion pieces sent to Northern newspapers, as well as voting by mail and absentee voting to set the terms of political debate in the North. So these guys, many of whom were not, strictly speaking, allowed to vote in the field, because some state legislatures said that since these guys had left state lines, they were no longer entitled to vote. Well, soldiers didn't like that, of course, and utilized all manner of resources to figure out how to influence the Northern public. So opinion pieces in newspapers and all sorts, and sending home straw poll tallies, all these sorts of things helped illustrate for me the connections between battlefield and home front when it came to the political story. And like I said, what makes this so interesting is that the Army of the Potomac, for much of the war itself, was George McClellan's army, even after one of the great formative moments for the Army when George B. McClellan was relieved of command in November 1862. So it's a story of politically aware young men having to navigate the channels of loyalty and dissent. So you start to see some very interesting dynamics play out. Republicans in the ranks answering to a Democratic high command. A lot of you are probably familiar with the fact that the Army of the Potomac had the highest number of Democrats in high command of any of the major Union field armies. So it was, in a lot of respects, the high command was an arm of the Democratic Party. So Republicans had to answer to that. At the same time, Democrats had to answer to a Republican administration. So lots of competing loyalties at play here in the Army of the Potomac that made it really, really interesting for me to study. And of course, the issues of the day revolved around things like emancipation. How harsh should the Northern war effort be? Right? Should the Northern war effort be aimed at revolutionizing Southern society? And to that end, how much blood and treasure should be expected of the Northern home front to prosecute this war? So should things like conscription be on the table? Should things like the suspension of certain civil liberties to aid the Northern war front be on the table? Abraham Lincoln, of course, with the Republican Party, is very much interested in a harsh war, a war of a war of very hard policy toward the Confederacy. Both while he is in command of the Army of the Potomac and especially later, George McClellan is very much an adherent to the old Democratic sort of understanding of Northern politics. A pro-Union stance, to be sure, but a stance that does not want to completely revolutionize Southern society, that wants to conciliate the Confederacy and avoid the sort of harsh punishment against the South that'll make Reconstruction, he and other Democrats believe, that much harder to accomplish. So those are the principal issues of the day. What I came to find over the course of my research, and one of the main pieces of my argument, is that officers, by which I mean here junior officers, so lieutenants, captains, and field grade officers like majors and colonels, had the most influence over the political complexion of the Army. So it wasn't necessarily guys like McClellan and Meade or Burnside who necessarily had the most impact on how soldiers viewed politics. It was the junior officers who had the most contact with the ranks. These were men who had been elected, oftentimes to their positions, by the men at the beginning of the war. And critically, these were officers who had their commissions awarded to them by state governors. So one of the main sources of evidence that I spent a lot of time digging for in state archives around the Northeast was all of these letters and petitions and testimonials from soldiers and civilians and politicians to the governors of the various states, espousing, this is why this particular officer should be awarded a commission, or this particular NCO should be promoted to junior officer. They're wonderful resources for seeing just how closely partisanship and officership were in the Union Army. So these guys were political creatures, these junior officers. They understood the political dynamics, and they tried to educate their men as best they could on what the war was about and what policy should be during the war. So it was really, really interesting to see just how important these junior officers were, these company and regimental commanders were in the Army of the Potomac toward educating the men in the ranks. So after McClellan was dismissed in 1862, that's where I think the story gets really interesting. Over the course of my book, I highlight a few different, I call them crisis periods, just political, very heated political moments in the Army's story that really tell us a lot about how important politics was to the Union Army, and like I said, how important the Union Army was to Northern politics. So the first thing I thought I would highlight for you guys, and something that not a lot of folks know that much about, is how the Northern, the appearance on the Northern home front of anti-war Democrats in late 1862 and early 1863 elicited a very strong reaction from the Army. So McClellan's dismissed in late 1862. As you probably know, his replacement, Ambrose Burnside, fumbles during the Fredericksburg campaign, and shortly thereafter, in Ambrose Burnside's place, Joseph Hooker is appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker sets out very quickly to reform the Army. And he does all sorts of really interesting stuff like implementing corps badges and reforming the pay system and implementing better leave policy for soldiers and everything. But the one thing that nobody's really addressed in any serious detail, and I try to do this in the book, is how under Hooker's command, all these junior officers, regimental and company grade commanders, start to develop very specific political messages that then find their way into newspapers across the North. So over the course of the spring of 1863, especially March and April, a flood of political resolutions emerges from the Army of the Potomac and hits the front pages of newspapers, big and small, throughout the North. We previously knew of about 15 of these resolutions. Over the course of my research, I found upwards of 60 just from the Army of the Potomac alone. So this was a very big deal. And what happened was junior officers would get together in the headquarters tent and write up some political resolutions. They would basically say, the emergence of the anti-war threat at home is so offensive to us as soldiers that we call on all loyal people on the home front to shun these copperheads, these anti-war protesters, and renew the national commitment to the war and therefore to the administration. So the junior officers would get together, write this stuff up, and then they would call the regiment forward on parade. And sometimes they would have the soldiers leave their muskets stacked so that it was, more like a true democratic gathering, small d democratic gathering, even though it was in the Army, and that made it very interesting. And then they would read these resolutions to the men in the ranks and ask the men in the ranks whether they agreed with them or not. It was some pretty dramatic stuff. And this flourished throughout the Army in March and April 1863 under Joseph Hooker. So I was able to track down a lot of these, and some of these resolutions are downright chilling in terms of how they call out Northerners for supporting Copperheads and Democrats in terms of Northern politics. So, for instance, the 3rd Pennsylvania Reserves, their resolutions were absolutely stunning in how they called on Northerners not just to shun Copperheads, but going so far as to say that Copperheads should all be killed. Okay, so there's language like the only right we guarantee to anti-war protesters on the home front is the right to die, that sort of language. And these soldiers volunteer, if necessary, to go home and exact that sort of vengeance on the anti-war movement. So these are some of the regiments that I encountered over the course of my research who passed these resolutions. And I just I tally these here so that you can see how pervasive it was throughout the Army. All of these anti-Copperhead resolutions emerged at a really important period for the Army of the Potomac in the wake of the Fredericksburg disaster. And it's one of the things I try to argue in my book, that these guys, by basically implementing this pro-Republican, pro-Lincoln, pro-administration, and anti-Copperhead movement, they really light the fire in the North to try to put down the Copperhead movement. And in so doing, they developed for the Army of the Potomac a renewed sense of purpose, almost, that had been eluding the Army ever since the dismissal of George B. McClellan. So I think it's a really interesting period, and it's an important formative moment for the Army politically. The Army is specifically throwing down the gauntlet, politically speaking, and daring anybody on the home front to resist the war. And even, like I said, going so far as to volunteer their prowess as soldiers to go home and exterminate Copperheads if needs be. It's some pretty chilling stuff. But also, like I said, very dramatic for the Army, and it gives them a previously elusive sense of purpose. So that's the first episode that I said not too many folks know about that you might find interesting. Fast forward just a little bit in 1863, and you find another really, really interesting period, something called the Mcclellan Testimonial. So this comes right after the Battle of Gettysburg. So the Army of the Potomac has finally won a victory. It's a big deal for the Army of the Potomac that they're not used to actually proclaiming that. But after the Battle of Gettysburg, it's clear to the high command of the Army of the Potomac, which is still pretty much Democratic, that is to say, still pretty much affiliated with the Democratic Party, that the rank and file are starting to turn Republican. The rank and file are starting to turn a little bit against the Democratic Party in some pretty profound ways. So at headquarters, George Gordon Meade, John Sedgwick, commanding the 6th Corps. Meade, of course, commands the whole Army at this time. John Sedgwick, commanding the 6th Corps. Andrew Humphreys, who's the Chief of Staff for the Army of the Potomac, and George Sykes, who commands the 5th Corps, start to talk about offering some sort of testimonial of affection to George McClellan on behalf of the Army of the Potomac. They don't necessarily see anything wrong with this. Testimonials like this are fairly common in the Army of the Potomac up till then. John Sedgwick himself had received, I think, a nice horse from the men under his command. Meade had received like a ceremonial sword. So these sorts of things aren't terribly uncommon. But what I found over the course of my research is that, and here's, by the way, a copy of the circular that headquarters had printed and disseminated to every company in the Army, saying that they want to raise money for a testimonial, quote, as an evidence that the warm feelings which McClellan has ever borne towards the Army is fully reciprocated by both officers and men. So you see, major generals are asked to contribute $20. Colonels are asked to contribute $5, and it goes on down the list. Captains, $1.50. Rank and file, 10 cents apiece. Doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you add it all up, you're talking approximately about $80,000 to $100,000 in 1863 money. And it can be a little tricky to try to figure out exactly what sort of sum we're talking about in today's money, but it's probably on the order of a couple $1 million. And a couple $1 million is more than a horse. It's more than a sword. This is a really, really big deal. And as you might expect, Republicans in the Army were not thrilled at the prospect of raising almost $100,000, again, probably a couple million in today's money, for a guy that the Lincoln administration had essentially drummed out of the war. So there's a couple guys at headquarters who do not subscribe to this. The commander of the 3rd Corps, David Bell Birney, and Oliver Howard, commanding the 11th Corps. Both of these guys are Republican, and they're not real thrilled with what's going on. As it turns out, some of the men in the ranks and the junior officers close to the men in the ranks are not that thrilled either. And several of these regiments that are not thrilled with this pass more political resolutions opposing the McClellan Testimonial. So on the left here, you see the original manuscript written by the officers of the 119th Pennsylvania in the 6th Corps from the Civil War Library Museum of Philadelphia. They wrote, "We consider the movement an ingenious political scheme designed for some other object, that it will be used by political demagogues as a weapon for the accomplishment of their unholy purposes." I wish we still wrote like that. So as if it weren't enough that they wrote and passed these resolutions, once again, they send them to the newspapers. So the Philadelphia Press, within just a few days of this thing breaking, they're publishing resolutions from within the Army talking about how commanders within the Army, their own commanders, are starting to play fast and loose with political loyalty. It's some really, really crazy stuff that emerges from the Army in this period. So eventually, this 111th Corps General, Karl Schurz, one of these German emigres who does reasonably well in the Army of the Potomac. He has his bad days, but he is a very staunch Republican. He finds out about this, and he's very close to Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, informs Chase about it. Chase, of course, runs over to Edwin Stanton, who's already apoplectic about something, I'm sure, and Stanton is furious when he finds out that the Army is raising money to support McClellan. And Stanton tells Lincoln, and he and Lincoln put a stop to this testimonial immediately. That doesn't prevent it from being a huge embarrassment to the Army's high command in the press, and from the high command having to refund all of the money that had been raised. And they had probably raised about $30,000 by the time the thing was discovered. What's interesting to note about this episode is that all of it happens just a few weeks before very important elections in Pennsylvania and Ohio in late 1863. Gubernatorial elections in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Another gubernatorial election in Maine as well, not nearly as contentious. But what you see in late 1863 is really the high watermark of these Copperhead Democrats. The Peace Democrats are trying to secure state houses in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and they nominate some pretty far out there figures like Clement Vallandigham, the Peace Democrat who had gotten in so much trouble with Lincoln that Lincoln kicked him out of the country. So they run him in absentia for governor, the Democrats do. And the soldiers pass more resolutions. Those who are allowed to vote at the front vote overwhelmingly against the Peace Democrats. So you get really, really interesting political resolutions from units like Hubert Dilger's Battery I, 1st Ohio, talking about how they want to turn their cannons back on the Copperheads. 7th Wisconsin, the Iron Brigade, they pass resolutions concerning very important elections back home in Wisconsin. And even the 20th Maine, fresh from defending Little Round Top at Gettysburg, in something I've never encountered in any history of the 20th Maine, of which, of course, there are plenty, they passed very staunch anti-Copperhead resolutions that September. Hey, you can probably hear the baby. So Pennsylvania is the same way. These Pennsylvania units, of which there are so many in the Army of the Potomac, passed resolutions against the Democratic candidate for governor, George Woodward. And Woodward was, as far as the soldiers were concerned, a Copperhead through and through. He had been a justice on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and had cast the majority, or had written the majority opinion for denying soldiers at the front the right to vote. So he was not well liked by the Army of the Potomac. Andrew Curtin, the incumbent governor of Pennsylvania, was very much well liked. He was the soldier's friend, as they called him. So Woodward was exceedingly unpopular. So to tie the Mcclellan Testimonial and this together, what I've just been talking about, on the eve of the gubernatorial election in Pennsylvania, George McClellan, seeking to solidify his support within the Democratic Party, formally endorsed George Woodward in the press. The soldiers in the Army of the Potomac who followed politics, and there were increasingly more and more of them, were absolutely livid. Letters from soldiers in the Army of the Potomac describing the reaction to this event talk about things like the disillusionment they were experiencing. One soldier in the 59th New York wrote, When Lincoln removed McClellan, we thought it wrong, for we worshiped him, but since we have learned better about him. So this is really interesting to see how the Army's commanders desperately tried to resuscitate McClellan's reputation right before McClellan does the unthinkable. He sides with the peace Democrats in the gubernatorial elections of '63. So that's almost a turning point. Well, it is a turning point in the Army's opinion of McClellan. Another thing I'll mention, spring of 1864, officers in the Army of the Potomac, and especially several who had been either removed from the Army of the Potomac or left because their terms of service expired, they start to publish books, memoirs, novels during the war itself. And there's a slew of these that come out in early 1864, talking about how McClellanism, as they called it, was hurting the Northern war effort. So you see here, McClellanism is a species of masonry in the Army. It's like this secret society where they all look out for each other. One of these books, called Red Tape and Pigeonhole Generals, describes Andrew Humphreys, the Army's chief of staff, when he had a line command in 1862 and '63, as a McClellan creature. And like McClellan, was used for disloyal purposes by designing men. So you see lots and lots of these opinions start to emerge in publication in early 1864. It's really interesting to see these guys really stick their necks out and publish some scathing stuff about their old commander. But there's a number of them that emerge in early 1864. All right, last thing I'll talk about, and then I'd open it up for some give and take here. Something that practically nobody has ever written about, I found, but it was really, really interesting nonetheless. So in early 1864, the terms of enlistment for a huge percentage of the Army of the Potomac run out. Men who had enlisted in mid-1861 to serve for 3 years were going to be out of the Army in mid-1864 unless they decided to re-up, to re-enlist. And what I found is that about a third of them chose to do so. Those who did not, either because they were exhausted, physically and mentally, they were wounded and were recuperating and had to go home, or they just thought it was time for the next wave of Union recruits to take up arms because they didn't know the war was less than a year from being finished. These guys went home and very quickly started mobilizing again into paramilitary companies to influence the 1864 election. And in my book, I highlight a few organizations that appear in places like New York and Philadelphia that show us just how much demobilized Union soldiers were participating in the campaigning process. The 1864 election, of course, like I've talked about, features a Republican Party which is actually expanding to include a number of war Democrats. So they technically call it the National Union Party. It's Abraham Lincoln and his new totally incompetent vice presidential nominee, Andrew Johnson, on the one hand. And they are very much, their platform is very much, pro-emancipation, unconditional surrender, finish the job, finish the war. On the other hand, the Democratic Party is splintered. So the Democratic Party is really walking a very difficult tightrope between not wanting to disrespect the sacrifice of the soldiers, but also recognizing that from their perspective, the Lincoln administration, and therefore the whole prosecution of the war is a failure. So they nominate George B. McClellan to be their standard bearer, but also nominate George Pendleton, a Copperhead from Ohio, to be their VP nominee. So it's really difficult to reconcile these two, even in retrospect, and it was incredibly difficult for political observers at the time to reconcile the two. So the Democratic Party is pretty much in a shambles in 1864. They try to piece together this sort of abstractly pro-union, sort of pro-civil liberty, anti-emancipation message that kind of comes across as a hodgepodge, because it is. Well, these veterans groups start popping up in the summer of 1864. In New York, something popped up called the Mcclellan Legion. And you won't find this until you really dig into the newspapers and into McClellan's personal papers at the Library of Congress. But this was really a blue blood patrician club for ex-Army of the Potomac officers to get together and toast George B. McClellan and organize speeches for him and political rallies at some of the finer establishments in New York City. Like, they would host a dinner at Delmonico's, and then sort of go to, rent a theater and have some speechifying about how great George McClellan was and how terrible Emancipation and Lincoln were. Don't believe me? Look it up. So we have guys like Abram Duryea of the 5th New York Zouaves, Hobart Ward, who commanded a brigade in the 3rd Corps. These staunch New York officers, they absolutely adore McClellan, and they mobilize lots and lots of junior officers sort of get out the vote among demobilized veterans in New York. Republicans are not about to be outdone in that regard. So also in New York City at the same time, you have the Veteran Union Club, the VUC. And this was basically run by the old hooker ring of the Army of the Potomac. So guys like Daniel Butterfield and Dan Sickles and Abner Doubleday. And you won't even find this really talked about in biographies of these guys, but they host events just like the McClellan Legion did. They publish stuff in the newspapers calling on veterans to sustain the Lincoln administration, to sustain the war effort. They meet at the Cooper Union, which of course was where Lincoln had sort of announced his presence to the Eastern Republicans in 1860. So it's a really, really important organization for veterans in New York. There are thousands of veterans affiliated with these two organizations. Philadelphia is a little bit more interesting. Whereas New York had been all about general officers, the organizations that appear in Philadelphia are all led by much lower ranking officers and a lot of enlisted men. So the McClellan Old Guard appears in Philadelphia, led by guys like Richard Penn Smith, Charles Kokersberger, and Buck McCandless of the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves. These guys are very anti-emancipation, very pro-Democrat, very pro-McClellan, and you can see there, "Give us back our old commander." That's their battle cry. Lots of torchlight processions, just like you had in 1860, with groups like the Wide Awakes marching through the streets of Philadelphia at night. It was intimidating to see these sorts of things in the streets. It was intimidating to read about them in the press. And a real sign that just because soldiers left the battlefront didn't mean they were leaving the war behind. Republicans had their own club, the Soldiers' Campaign Club, led by other officers from the same brigade, the Philadelphia Brigade, DeWitt Clinton Baxter and Turner Moorhead, and Peter Elmacher of the 119th Pennsylvania. So by October 1864, there were competing torchlight processions in Philadelphia, and there was violence. I came across a soldier who was killed, or at least a veteran who was killed, trying to protect the Republican headquarters, or the Soldiers Campaign Club headquarters in Philadelphia. So there's brawling, there's all sorts of really fun stuff to read about. Just as an example of what this sort of thing could do to veterans from a particular unit, this is the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves. You have some officers who align with the Republicans in the Soldiers Campaign Club, and some officers who align with the McClellan Old Guard. There was a real battle to determine who would get to claim the regiment's battle flag and bring it to their political rally. And the McClellan Old Guard won. They got to take the battle flag to a rally in downtown Philadelphia. So that's just one example, again, of the sort of activity you probably didn't know that much about, but that you'll find in the book. Of course, the Army votes overwhelmingly for Lincoln in 1864, and these campaign clubs are a big part of that, sending literature to the front and everything. So the last thing I talk about in my book, what happened to soldiers after the war when they came home? And what I found was that the same political loyalty they had argued for, loyalty to the Lincoln administration as the war went on, and voted for in 1864, this was basically what they campaigned for in 1865 and 1866. So I talk a little bit about the Reconstruction politics and how important the veterans were to events in the late 1860s. So that's a little bit about what you can expect if you pick up the book, but that's I just thought those were some of the more interesting tidbits from the book to highlight, since not that many folks typically know about those things. So with that, I think we have a few minutes left. I'm happy to take some questions if you have any. So you can, Kelly, I believe you said just use the chat function, right?
Yes, yeah. If you can just go ahead and use the chat feature for us. It gets a little confusing with a lot of people online if people unmute. So actually everyone is muted. But just use that chat feature. If you've got a question, just type it into the box, and you can find the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that and just type in. So anyone have any questions tonight? I found that to be a fascinating talk, and it's not something that I was really familiar with beforehand. All right, are we chat? It says chat disabled. Huh. All right, let me see, because it should not be. Can chat with everyone. All right, maybe that's, I don't know how it got on there, but now it is, you should be able to chat now. I'm not sure why or how I got it turned off, but it is on now. So
Buzz says it works. So
all right, good. Thank you, Buzz. That's, I think, probably why I saw some hands waving.
Okay.
Yeah, let's see. So you should be able to okay, well, it is Janet, the chat is working now, so feel free. All right, and with that link, I thought I had typed it incorrectly, but you can also just go to UNC Press and then make your way to the books that they have available. as well. All right. So do we have anybody who has any questions?
Okay, so let's see.
I'm seeing some thank yous.
Janet asks, were votes required to register by party during this time? What if soldiers wanted to change their party affiliation? That's a good question. Voting in the 1860s was much different from voting today. Ballots were distributed by the parties. So getting out the vote was something that was incumbent upon the party apparatus. Party agents would have been nominated by the individual state governors to go to the front and give out ballots to soldiers. So either a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot. And then they would cast the ballots, put them in something like a drum or an ammunition box, something like that. So a soldier would have to go up and request a particular party's ballot and then vote according to that ballot. So it wasn't like the sort of official party registration process that we have today, where you register as a Republican or a Democrat and vote according to that in the primary, unless it's an open primary. It wasn't quite like that, and the process of determining who would be party agent was really interesting as well. I was able to track down the example of Pennsylvania. Andrew Curtin, who, spoiler alert, wins re-election in 1863 and is governor in 1864. He specifically nominates veterans from those two veteran organizations I mentioned, the ones in Philadelphia. So he specifically says William McCandless from I think it was the McClellan Old Guard, and one of the other gentlemen from the Republican organization to go to the front. I don't know if that answers, hopefully that answers your question, Janet. It's a good one. Any other questions?
It looks like there was one about how did Abe handle dealing with McClellan, and who are the wide awakes?
Okay, sure. Well, how did Lincoln handle McClellan? That could easily be a topic for a whole other session that I'd love to do. But long story short, Lincoln tolerated McClellan until it was no longer politically necessary to do so. Lincoln tolerated McClellan in command of the Army of the Potomac because Lincoln believed, and I think he was probably right, that there was simply nobody else to put in McClellan's place. McClellan wasn't a terrible commander, but he wasn't a particularly solid commander in a lot of respects. And Lincoln's problem was that he simply didn't have anybody to replace McClellan with. And Ambrose Burnside demonstrated that point in late 1862. So Lincoln removes McClellan after the midterm elections of 1862, when it becomes clear that it's no longer politically necessary for Lincoln to tolerate a Democrat like McClellan in that particular place. Well, I'll leave it there. There are plenty of great books you could read that talk more specifically about Lincoln and McClellan. My book looks more at the perception of those two within the Army. But it was a very tense relationship, of course. And who are the wide awakes? Another great question. The wide awakes were an organization that popped up throughout the North in the campaign season of 1860 to support Abraham Lincoln. They were young men who organized into companies and battalions of paramilitary stature. So they had uniforms that looked alike. They carried kerosene torches to be really sort of intimidating by marching around in formation at night. And they were ostensibly started as a bodyguard for Lincoln in Illinois, but really spread throughout the North. And there is an overlap between the Wide Awakes in 1860 and the same paramilitary organizations I talked about in 1860. And then I see Buzz's question, any indication that the New York City riots provoked a response by Lincoln's supporters in uniform? Another good question. I talk a little bit about the draft riots in my book. The soldiers, there's this sort of myth that soldiers fresh from Gettysburg, were sent to New York to try to stifle the New York City draft riots. It's a little bit more complicated than that. A lot of Army of the Potomac soldiers did make it to New York, but they made it too late. The draft riots were pretty much done by the time they got there. And to be perfectly honest, a lot of soldiers were very disappointed when they got to New York and found that the draft riots were done, because they were ready to kill some copperheads. They were ready to kill some anti-war protesters, no doubt about it. And something else I looked at in my book is there's serious overlap between the units that pass political resolutions in early 1863 and units that the Lincoln administration and Henry Halleck call on specifically to go to New York to put down the draft riots. There were only 2 New York regiments I found that passed political resolutions in 1863. And I think both of them were called on to go to New York to put down the draft riots. That's a good question.
All right, and did we have any other questions? I'll do one last call for questions. Again, I apologize for having the chat turned off. As many times as I do this, I think there's going to be one time where it goes flawlessly, and I don't think it's happened yet, but hopefully we'll get there. The link, I did go to the website and just copy and paste it. So hopefully that link for the book, if you want to purchase it from UNC Press, will work. Oh, one last question from Buzz.
Buzz, any indication that there were any shifts in loyalties in the ranks as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation? This is probably the most heated question that historians ask about politics in the Union Army. How much of the support for Lincoln in the ranks was support for emancipation? I tend to fall in the camp of historians who believes that soldiers did in fact come around to the idea of emancipation, understanding that it was a necessary measure to finish the war. So of the political resolutions I looked at, for instance, maybe about 10 to 20% of them specifically mention emancipation directly, but there is lots of evidence that they were referencing emancipation in sort of oblique ways, talking about, we subscribe to all the policies of the Lincoln administration. Well, guess what? That includes emancipation. Or we support all measures to weaken the rebellion. Again, emancipation. And I recognize that there's almost certainly a lot of, there's certainly a lot of reticence and some racism in the Union Army that makes it necessary to reference emancipation in oblique ways instead of directly. But that's another good question. It's a tough one. I tend to think that soldiers did come around to emancipation. That's not to say that all soldiers were staunch abolitionists. Some of them were, but it was generally accepted by the Army, I submit to you, as a necessary war measure.
Great, thank you, and thank you all for tuning in tonight. Thank you for your questions. Zach, excellent talk. I, for one, truly enjoyed it, so thank you. And just keep checking our website for more great book talks and programs. So I will end the meeting tonight, but thank you all for your participation.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.